What follows is an absolute must-watch for any student of depth psychology, or anyone looking to apply a psychodynamic model to their own self-development. It covers, from Steve and Pauline Richards' psychosystems analysis, the most cutting-edge understanding of what consciousness, as such, actually is, including an exegesis on cognition, affect, sensation, and somatic representation, their purpose and how and why they evolved, in theory, and their dynamics in lived experience. You're very welcome to test this out in real time while watching the video, simply by shifting your awareness of what you, as being, is. This theory, as well as other psychodynamic elements you might be familiar with, the anima, self-concept, instincts, meta-instincts, and several others, are applied in real time to address issues of identity, that is, identified complexes, social anxiety, healing a family complex, and even understanding and integrating the meaning behind a psychedelic trip. By means of a very brief introduction, this video is a full case study in dialectic form of a recent single 90-minute consultation between Steve Richards and an anonymized student of psychosystems analysis. The student is a very intelligent and very high potential person who kindly gave their full written permission for this video to be made for the benefit of all. Thank you. I've narrated both parts of the dialectic, Steve and the student, marking out who is saying what at what time. Everything spoken by Steve is more or less a word-for-word direct transcription, and only lightly edited for pacing. If you like this style of learning and study, then we actually have a book available on Amazon, IPSA Collected Works Volume 5, Discourses on Psychodynamics, that contains over 400 pages of real-time dialectic between Steve Richards and many, many serious students of depth psychology, covering the entire bandwidth of topics within the field. It's been a true privilege for me to compile and edit that book, as it has been for me to make this video, as the insights of Steve and Pauline's psychosystems analysis simply cannot be found anywhere else. They're unique, original, and utterly groundbreaking, representing the most cutting-edge theory and the most immediately practical, therapeutic, and self-development methodology of psychodynamic clinical psychophysiology. The new paradigm of psychotherapy truly is here. The following few minutes will be an introduction, a summarised account of the first few minutes of the consultation to give you some essential grounding beforehand. After that, the dialectic will begin. The student begins with an account of a recent trip on LSD, taken for self-development purposes. They overdosed, or, to quote them, went above the amount they were normally comfortable with. They listened to music at the same time, a rap song with antisocial lyrics. Affect arose which didn't match the lyrical content of the song at all. Instead, the affect indicated a deep need for a serious, loving relationship. He interpreted it as the anima in a representable form. Then he had an intense feeling of empathy, which generated tears, for how he had treated women he had previously had encounters and maladapted relationships with, as if from their perspective. Then the antisocial lyrical content of the song produced a deep feeling of masculinity. Not pseudo-masculine, as in antisocial, but genuinely powerful, protective instincts for his family. He saw a need to integrate within himself a masculine side and a loving side together. Then he felt his muscles completely relax, but yet he was filled with energy. He was actually able to shadow box for a very long period of time at great power. Then the trip morphed into him being threatened with the most horrifying torture imaginable. To quote, maximum pain for the maximum amount of time, which he described as hell. It was so scary he did not want to share the details of the torture. The pain he felt during this part of the trip was not actually from the torture itself, it was from the fear of something like that ever actually coming true. Time then began to slow down, which began to scare him further, as it was reminiscent of the idea of eternity, which the torture was threatening him with. He thought that the only way to end such pain, if it ever came true, would be to kill himself. He began to pray to God for help. To Steve, in the consultation, he offered an interpretation. Fundamentally, that his experience was a representation of instincts, and the removal of complexes. His complex previously blocked an appreciation for how he had made women feel in the past. His increased energy and relaxation showed he had a baseline drive state, and that there was actually nothing to be anxious about. He was just wasting his energy away. The fear of torture section was, somehow, a representation of frustrated instinct. Steve confirmed that the student had good ego strength, as he was able to coherently articulate, with interpretation, what he had been through, and with great technical detail. Steve also stated that he does not recommend anyone take psychedelics because of the harm that they can generate, but nevertheless, the student had experienced something genuine and potentially very valuable. Steve then prompted the student with the following question: what do you do with that information? Meaning from his trip. The student suggested that the place to start, as an action point to move from, post-experience, was with his family. He'd been neglecting his mother, his stepfather and his grandmother, as he blames his mother for generating his maladaptations and his complexes in the first place. But he's accepted that she made mistakes, and he wants to contradict the familial conflict through behaving in a more caring way, in his words, the care system from Yak Pangsep, towards his family, as it's the most immediate presence in his home. The emphasis was on behaviour to contradict the complex. Steve confirmed the approach and then said, "So you've experienced the positive side of the archetype of the Anima, in a positive sense?" The student replied that through that experience, he's aware that the next relationship that he will have will need to be different to his previous ones. He learned a lot through seeing how he hurt women. He's no longer naive about female nature. He said he wants to intellectually understand female nature, but he's also aware that there has to be love in a relationship too. He can't settle for an unconscious relationship. The main focus now, from his point of view, would be an intellectual approach to understanding women. Steve again confirmed this approach as being a strong theoretical understanding, but also a lived experience which the student was able to relate to. Steve then stated that the appearance of the ex-girlfriend in the experience was simply a representation and not to be taken literally. Whatever the deep structure component of it was, it could be represented as an image in potentially lots of different ways. It was important, however, to accept what had been presented as the psyche had given it, which the student of course had done. Then Steve mentioned the part of the experience in which the student felt that his body completely relaxed. The dialectic that now follows starts immediately at that point. Steve: there is a fundamental representation which we can say is conscious, that is, of the body. Phylogenetically, it's very ancient and goes back to any system that can represent itself to itself. Therefore, in a biological system, a single cell that has a representation of its own boundary through its cell wall or cell membrane and can represent a homeostatic state to itself has a form of consciousness, which is somatic. It's only at the cellular level, but then as evolution progresses, that becomes multicellular, organs, more primitive organs, and so on. That is never lost. It's always there. But by the time we get to modern humans, we have 4 qualia of consciousness: somatic, sensory, affect, that is instinct, and cognition. Cognition and affect are the two primary ones that we suffer from, because they compete for a rational interpretation of the world. Jung's theory of type supports that, where he said that feeling and thinking were both rational functions. I think he's right. They're representational qualia, but obviously, when you are in your trip, you access the somatic ego very deeply, and the sensory ego, and the affect, and the cognition, and also were aware of the fact that all were simultaneously present. But they're not always in association to reflexive ego consciousness. But when you were in that state, you were able to experience that. The student. Is the somatic ego a constituent of the ego itself, or is it a separate mechanism? Steve. It's an evolutionary category and qualia. The way I personally define consciousness is a complexity of information which can represent itself to itself. Just a quick note from me, James. This definition of consciousness, defined in terms of information, has been used by Steve and Pauline since the early 1980s, and fully codified into their informational monism and superposition theory by 1988. For a full understanding, we highly recommend a study of IPSA Collected Works Volume 1, of which the second edition is soon to be published. Steve continues. It is information, fundamentally, that when at a certain level of complexity, we can say is not just a law of nature, it's not just mathematics, it's not just physics, it's now chemistry too. And then it becomes biology, and then at its simplest form, we have a form of understanding which is biological, but is not yet psychological, and it's not completely connected to the sense of self. So at a very primitive level, a somatic ego understands itself. That is present and in a nested hierarchy with the other three qualia of ego consciousness. In normal functioning, you will notice this. Obviously, we can become aware when the somatic ego intrudes and gives us a read on the physiological state that we're in. This displaces the contents of the Miller number. So cognition is set aside, affect is set aside, external senses are set aside, and we're aware of a representation, reflexively, of some state within our body. The somatic ego is always there, it's just that its valency is not particularly high with respect to consciousness. The student. So a single-celled organism can represent itself to itself. Steve. A complexity of information which represents itself to itself can be considered to be conscious. Not human, psychological, cognitive consciousness, but an understanding of itself as being. There are qualia of this which still echo in our modern ego. We're normally aware of being in an affect state even more than we are when we're in just a cognitive state. And most people don't realise this, because the processing that's going on just behind the scenes, even when we're being cognitive, is primarily affect, because instinct is pushing all the time. Then we resolve that and try and understand it using cognition, and then further back from that is the sensory ego. That's where mindfulness or meditation comes in, when people focus on immediate experience. They drop register into a sensory-based awareness. The somatic ego is very ancient and it never goes away. It's just that we're not particularly aware of it. The student. So, affect is always present, but it's not always in the ego's Miller number. Steve. Imagine if you were a paleo-hominid who is primarily affective. At some point, the nascent cognitive part of the brain would have evolved, and then cognition starts to intrude into the affect. This is the mirror for us now. We think literally that cognition is the high point of consciousness, but affect starts to intrude, and we become neurotic, principally when those two are in conflict with one another. But for a paleo-hominid, it would have been the reverse. the intruder would have been the cognition. Cognition would have been disturbing, and it would have made us out of kilter with our environment, with our family, our group, our tribe, and we become progressively further away from instinct, which nevertheless pushes. Because the affect ego has been around for a long time, and most of our adaptation in terms of time has been through affect, and affect is challenging for us, but for them, it would have been cognition that would have been challenging. Are you familiar with the science fiction film 2001: A Space Odyssey? It opens with these primitive pre-human creatures who are acting like chimpanzees. They have that level of awareness. Then an obelisk is there, a tall black rock which one of them touches, and it sends out a noise which turns into music, and suddenly this creature has an idea about making a weapon. He starts to break bones, and then he broke one of his rival paleo-hominids' heads with it, and he has this awareness of cognition, throwing the bone into the air, which then becomes a space station, and then we're in the year 2001, as envisaged 50 years ago, and they were in space, and then there was another one of these obelisks showing how evolution might be connected to aliens, which of course I'm not suggesting. It was interesting to see how the filmmakers thought that would occur. When cognition kicked in, there would be a gear change that would give an advantage, which is why it survived. But we can't leave the affect behind. It insists itself. The student. To return to the topic of single-celled organisms, you said that their version of consciousness can represent itself to itself. Could you provide an example of how this information is represented to itself while it's navigating around and so on? Steve. It would have to do it through a form of perception. So it would have to understand its internal environment, which would be based very much on the soma and on receiving sensory information initially, before that organism becomes more progressively evolved. So that has to be the ground state. You can't get perception without a soma to register the fact that it exists, and it's receiving information from its environment. The sensory ego then, so to speak, will be very primitive as well, and will kick in very soon, so somatic and sensory is sufficient for most primitive forms of life. But then there's also the genome and the possibility of field phenomenon and how that can share information beyond the boundary of, say, a single-celled organism. The way I look at it is like how an archaeologist would look at layers in the ground, and then look at the order of things and how they complement one another, and they are necessary to be there in that sense, because when you work in depth in this field, literally or metaphorically if you take the archaeology, you will find all four of these qualia present at the same time. But it's the focus that's the important thing, and what we actually identify with. The Miller number is limited in capacity, but not all of that is in the senses. It can be shut off, and we can just disappear and generate internal imagery, and we find that, if we look, there's affect behind that. This modelling of entire scenarios that could be very ancient, and we follow that and we get deeper and deeper in, and at some point we start to lose the qualia of ego consciousness completely, and we're into a non-ego form of consciousness. This is an important distinction. These are ego, if you like, or a sense of awareness, forms of consciousness that we can potentially access under normal conditions. But there are experiences which represent in those qualia which appear not to originate in them. That's really interesting when you can get into that kind of experience. The student. And that's non-ego consciousness. Steve. Exactly. That's the non-ego conscious consciousness. Because the definition I'm using, consciousness is a complexity of information that represents itself to itself, is very broad. It can include such things as platonic fields. So Roger Penrose is a Nobel laureate in physics and was a collaborator with Professor Stephen Hawking. We have a video on Jung To Live By with Professor Stuart Hameroff, a collaborator with Penrose on quantum consciousness. Penrose says, in his view, that consciousness is not algorithmic and not computational. I disagree personally, for what it's worth. I would say that it is platonic, it is quantum, it is computational and algorithmic simultaneously in different ways. They're all present at the same time, but our awareness of what is operating at those different levels is dependent upon many factors. And depending on what state we are in overall, we can access, perhaps, quantum field elements of consciousness that are collective and non-ego in that normal sense. If we take consciousness to be a complexity of information, and Penrose basically does, then when it reaches a certain level of complexity, we have what we experience with our limited Miller number. But the whole system's in place, everything is there, it is conscious unto itself, and it is also conscious of communication and regulation in a homeostatic way. But our ego is such a small thing with its Miller number, and we tend to collapse the waveform into representation that we can maintain within our Miller number. But all the rest of it is always there. The reason I think this is true is because of the kind of experience that you've had, where when you alter the state so that different levels of consciousness are simultaneously accessible. That can be through what you went through, it can be through a dream, it can be through meditation, it can be through something as ordinary as having a fever. Some people have transpersonal experiences. Consciousness appears to be expanded, which, in my view, is being aware of the different representational qualia that are there anyway. There's an objective waveform, but your subjective waveform, when you expand it, includes more of the objective waveform of information as a field phenomenon which is present simultaneously. The student. It seems that the Miller number still applies though, in that we can't really seem to process this high multitude of information. Is it the case that the non-ego consciousness pushes itself up into ego consciousness in larger chunks? Steve. Larger chunks, yes, but the key is the representation. During your experience, your psyche chose to use your ex-girlfriend to represent what appears to be a very broad bandwidth symbol. A symbol, in order to actually be a symbol, should always represent more or other than what it appears to be. It's like a compressed file, or a chunk. But when people go through the kind of experience that you've gone through, or similar states, then they appear to access heavier chunks of information, which start to unpack itself at its own rate. The Miller number becomes extremely focused, and the time dilation that you experienced as well shows the speed of information processing and unpacking that was going on. So the Miller number is expanded at that point. You could say that your ego consciousness was expanded because you're processing more information and more meaning. But in an everyday sense, you couldn't walk around being in that state because you'd probably get deleted by the next car or bus that comes along. So you need the Miller number setting to be optimal for your actual physical survival and for its role, which it's designed for. I use design metaphorically as a term for what it's evolved for, which is adaptation to the outside world. That is why our ego is so compressed and why it's so limited, but the other forms of consciousness are there because they're exchanging energy and information all the time. I would call that the objective waveform of consciousness. The subjective waveform is whatever we collapse into in terms of representation at any one time. You've had an experience which increased your subjective waveform enough to see a great deal and portrayed representationally to you, and it seems to have been of great benefit, so I can't fault that. The student. You know so much information that I couldn't get anywhere else. Your understanding seems so far beyond those who are limited by hard scientific evidence gleaned through rigorous study. Steve. Thank you. We are scientific, but we're aware of the limitations of the method. The method collapses into itself, and that's a huge problem. Cognition tends to collapse into rumination in a circular way, and it traps itself. Philosophy is the worst offender. All the modern, rational Western philosophy is very close to being OCD. It's just a loop, and they don't get out of it. The qualia is overamped, inflated, and self-satisfied, so it shrinks. But then it cannot see beyond itself. That's a problem, and when we encounter things which run contrary to that, which nevertheless happen, such as the expansion of consciousness that you had, or paranormal or parapsychological phenomena, then the cognition collapse says, no, it never happened. Meanwhile, if you work in depth with these people and access their dreams, fantasies and complexes, you find that every other part of them knows that this informational field is huge and it extends beyond an individual. It's just that they've collapsed into their cognition. This is allowed by the psyche to happen, so long as the survival of that person or their mental health, either of those two, is not compromised. It's like, okay, well, fair enough. The ego is doing its job. We are surviving. We're feeling that biological imperative to survive and adapt. It may not be optimal, but it's good enough. Hence, they're allowed to do it, and they don't see the collapse. It's just how limited their field of consciousness is. I don't believe in woo-woo. Woo-woo, to me, is something which doesn't happen. Anything that does is not woo-woo. It's real. That means we have to understand it. The student. That's a much better approach than those who get stuck on needing to have hard facts in front of them before doing anything. I think Freud and Jung were so influential because they were not afraid to use their own empiricism. Rather than have document observations with thousands of people, they were able to see patterns in their own life. If we relied on scientific study to take any action whatsoever, we'd be completely paralysed. Steve. We would, and that's the problem, which makes people, as Jung would have said, one-sided and neurotic. He would have said that as soon as the person collapses into hyper-rationality, or psychological reductionism, then the rest of the system is going to be poised to counter that maladaptation or one-sidedness at the earliest opportunity. You do see that with people who are hyper-rational. They're disconnected from their instincts, they're disconnected from optimal physical health and relationships. All of those things suffer. Well, fine, there's a payoff, and so long as you're relatively alright, your biology, your genome will leave you alone. But as soon as your optimized potential exceeds what you're actually doing in your life, you will find something knocking on the door from the inside. And if you ignore that, it'll project onto the outside. As Jung said, you will meet your internal fate externally. It will be superpositioned. It'll be in both states, internal and external, simultaneously. That's another thing about consciousness. It is superpositioned. It's in several simultaneous states, and, to itself, it is a field phenomenon. The ego just doesn't notice it most of the time, but when it does, it reacts in the form of superstition or hyper-rationality. For example, statistics, which is numerology, the superstitious belief in the power of numbers. The hyper-rational mind will generate a superstition and conceal it by saying it's a statistical truth, or something of that nature. So all of these things happen and they're normal and they're human. But you know the level that someone is at, and you know that they won't be able to adapt when they encounter certain things. If the person has higher potential than what they've collapsed into, they will suffer from that. They will suffer from their unlived life. The student then describes their social anxiety and how they address it in daily life. In summary, they contradict their tendency for social withdrawal through deliberately pushing themselves to be as extroverted and chatty as possible. However, they were concerned that by doing this, they would develop a kind of symptom substitution. By addressing only the behavioural component in this way, was there a risk of something compensating for this deeper in the psyche? Steve is asked for comment. Steve: that is a really good observation, and it fits the long-term psychodynamic model, which is always looking for that to happen. Symptom substitution or complexes reconfiguring. That can happen, except where what you're doing is why CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, works when it does work. The cognitive part of CBT is about how the ego sees itself. The behavioural side is how it acts in the world. The latter is more important than the former, because you bypass the cognitive qualia of consciousness, which itself may have been taken over by subnuclei, as Piaget would have called them. Complexes or dissociated elements that have an autonomous life and control over your thoughts. But it's action in the world which instincts, and therefore affect, and also sensory and somatic ego qualia, agree with. I'm introverted, apparently, but I do know the value of extroversion. Without it, we cannot adapt properly in the world. We just can't do it. Freud's observation was that there is a pleasure principle, as he called it, which is instinctive gratification. Then there's the ego and the reality principle, which is the testing of instincts against the world and assessing if they can work, or if it will lead to being deleted. This necessity of testing leads to frustration, and that's basically as far as Freud got with the idea. But at least he got that far. When people act differently in accordance with instinct, and therefore more in accordance with affect, not complex affect, but instinct affect. In other words, the meta-instincts are now the scenario through which the pansepian instincts are operating. Then the negative cognition, which is part of any complex that we've acquired through negative behaviour modification of learning, goes away, because it's not sustained or reinforced any further. That is the key. Pure behaviourists, so not CBT cognitive behaviourists, focus only on action in the world. That will only go so far with a purely behavioural model, because it does not consider instinct or affect properly, and its only action in the world, sometimes the action that they suggest that a person does, simply doesn't feel right at an instinctive level, and that's where the separation occurs for that when it's on its own. When it's paired with cognition, as in CBT, then you can use autosuggestion at the cognitive level to engage the behaviour, to make it make enough sense for the affect to back off. That is when it works. When it doesn't work, and when it doesn't, there's a dose-effect curve with an immediate improvement that, over time, sinks back down again. It's because the autosuggestion is no longer working, and that's because they don't access affect and instinct sufficiently. In other words, the meta-instinct. And the trajectory of an individual's life is not understood. The meta-instincts and the trajectory is the province of depth psychology and psychodynamics. So if they understood that, then CBT would have to modify itself, and it would in effect become complex therapy rather than CBT. So you're right, you've teased out those elements that work in the real world, and what I've tried to do is show that when these reductive therapies work, that's why they work, and when they fail, that's why they fail. The psychodynamic model can fail too, and it does so because it makes things happen over too long a period of time. What happens there is the homeostasis of the whole system starts to reject the fact that this is taking too long, and that the theory that very often is internalised, whether it's Freudian or Jungian or something with a psychodynamic base, is getting in the way, because it becomes a cognitive reductionism. It's an idea, and it's not an experience. There isn't enough action in the world, and very often affect is taken to be a problem. It's taken to be a symptom. It's not taken to be a form of consciousness, which it is. Affect is the carrier wave of instinct. So if you can get into affect, you're automatically closer not only to the pansepian instincts, but your meta-instincts, and therefore your genome. That is the key. The student. It's interesting. If you look at brain scans of imagined versus real visual experiences, there's way more information present in the latter, so actual experiences must have more of an effect. Steve: we are a biological configuration, so we have to obey biological rules, laws and adaptations. Whatever else is here, like a platonic or a morphogenetic or Sheldrakean field, must be here at the same time as the biology. Panksepian instincts are circuits within the brain that involve neurotransmitters, but they also, at the lower level of description, involve genes. Also, the circuit is nothing without the capacity to generate the behaviour in the world. So, to collapse a Panksepian instinct only into the brain, or neural circuits, is insufficient to explain them. It's all of the above at the same time, and when they're in synchrony, in rapport, in harmony, then the organism works efficiently. That is what we should aim for. The student: I don't have a job. I live with my parents, and I'm okay with that. I'm young, and I have time to work on moving forward with my life. The issue I'm feeling now is, what can I practically do right now to move forward to securing a relationship? What am I going to do? Bring a girlfriend back to my parents' house? I don't feel comfortable with that. So my question is, can you help with my tendency to be narrow-minded whilst I work on securing my independence? Steve: that was where we were at last time we spoke. As I recall, you were emphasising your adaptive strategy thus far, and where you felt comfortable, and then you felt compelled to take the substance, and then you were presented with the representation of things which were very different to one another. That really, I'm sure, tells you a great deal about what your own system wants for you in terms of homeostasis. To speak on the psychedelic experience, on the one side, there was probably the sum of all of your fears, represented that way, even if it didn't represent each individual fear. It was the sum of them, and even had a religiose quality to it, because of the way you described it. Hell-like. The experience of the positive feminine that you got revealed to you how your past adaptation has treated women. So you got to see yourself as the women see you. That as you described it to me, but you also had an impression of the very positive side of the image or imago of the feminine. The experience might be saying, this is a description of the split within you. On the one hand, there's a drive, fear, and the negative expression through meta-instincts, of your genome, and your potential. On the other side is the potential solution for it. The experience may have shown you the positive first, and then the negative afterwards. That's like a carrot and a stick, metaphorically, leading with the carrot, that is to say, the incentive. But if you were to model these two, and then ask yourself the question again as a thought experiment, you might see that the answer was presented to you, that the way that you relate to women, and therefore behave in the world and bring your instincts into release in the environment, itself may need adjusting, because the way you're relating to women and how you value them, and whether it's their appearance or their attractiveness as you've been understanding it, may need to be adjusted before the rest of your system can come online. The student: maybe, but it's interesting. Each time I contradict the complex through increasing my extroversion, even though the positive effect can last for a few days, it still reveals itself to be only a temporary effect. I feel like I need to keep doing this long term until I'm habituated to a new self-concept. A self-concept that says, this is me, I am the extroverted guy, and I do this in all scenarios, all the time, for the past 6 months, for the past year, etc. This is the new me. Steve: I agree, but I would just add something to that. What you said fits a rational model of a conclusion. In other words, a state that you will reach eventually. But what you were gifted in your substance experience was something which is more on a Jungian level, which had to do with the complete situation being understood, represented to you, and the information that you need to make all of that happen in a different way than the way you might at the moment cognitively think of doing it. I hope I explained that okay. The student. I only have a vague idea of what you mean. Would you mind explaining further? Steve. In other words, what was represented to you was a very high bandwidth representation of the solution. The way that you relate to women at the moment is instinctive in a short-term reward sense, which made sense given how your life has gone, and the experiences that you've had, starting with your mum, right the way through, and even of that psychopathic friend of yours, which was discussed in a previous consultation, as well, and all of those adaptations. But they've not led to an optimal state of adaptation or relationship. So it seems that your experience with the substance was giving you insight into an alternative that would solve everything, even if you could actually reach that state. If that's true, and I suspect it probably is, then going about it rationally through reprocessing or reconfiguring your old approach will still slow you down, because you're still in that cognitive interpretation of your instincts to say, this takes time, this has got to happen, that's got to happen, I can't impress unless A, B, C, D all line up nicely for me. Then you'll get the social anxiety, because what's underneath how it appears on the surface is just you delivering the real you, the substantial you, with your care system as you've described it, your relating function, Jungian Anima, all of that working properly. That would solve all of that, and there wouldn't be any need for a cognitive understanding of what you were doing. Your Miller number would be free of cognitive dissonance, for example. You would just be relating. So that's probably where the adjustment needs to take place, and that's probably why it's appeared in the way that it did when you took the substance. The student. So in order to create a change, the complex needs to be contradicted in the real world. So I can't just remove the complex. I'd have to go and practice relating to women in a different way. Steve. You need a different iteration of you that comes from within, which then acts in the world, rather than the configuration which includes the complexes you've acquired within your self-concept that are identified with. So currently, when you start to make changes, you can obviously see that immediately you come up against their resistance. There is an element of habituation, as you said, and we could think of it in a behavioural way and say that that approach is all we need to do. Sure, but that's still only an idea. It's still a rationalism. What I'm saying is actual relating is an affective state, which is instinctive and not cognitive. A cognitive model that's disconnected from your emotions and your instincts is more likely to fail than one that is connected to them. So the initial configuration that you have before you move out will be important, and that's where the hard work will need to be done, because it will be unfamiliar to you. The student. Right, so there needs to be a reconfiguration of my understanding, which will then motivate the correct behaviour in the world? Steve. Yes, and that reconfiguration of understanding of yourself should be based on instinct and affect, primarily, rather than cognition. You're very good at cognition, very, very good at it, and that's a plus. But it's got its minus as well, and I do think that's what's being communicated to you through the experience that you had. The student. But it is cognition that initially goes out and touches the understanding, right? It's the thing that goes out and interfaces with the information that becomes understanding, right? Steve. Can I contradict you there? I'm awfully sorry, but it actually isn't. It's that the cognition confirms the connectedness to instinct and affect. Emotion is a priori. It happens, it's there, but if we're not connected to it, it's present, but not acknowledged. The student. So the cognition is just an illusion that comes after the affect. Steve. It is. The value of cognition means that we can access a representation of the affect state without being in it. It's virtual modelling. Otherwise, we would permanently need to be in a particular drive state, or be high, but we can't do that because the Miller number will be overwhelmed. This is the intrusion of cognition into the Paleolithic affect mind, that gives it an advantage, but when it's taken too far, then it's not. It becomes a problem. We collapse into cognition and we don't understand affect at all. Therefore, we're disconnected from instincts, and instincts are just a reified idea. So the value of cognition is that it confirms downstream of something which is already present, and we can access it through memory. But if we lead with cognition disconnected from affect and instinct, we're unlikely to relate properly. The student. Whenever I'm behaving confidently, how I want to behave, then I'm confident in what I say. Contrast that to when I'm being dishonest. I actually come across as anxious. I find that really interesting, and it ties into what you said about there being an instinctive conflict. Perhaps it's a working care system that creates the anxiety whilst lying. I say that because I know that psychopaths literally don't feel any anxiety when they lie. So what's the next step beyond updating my understanding and allowing it to transfer across into my behaviour? Steve. The next step is for you to feel authentic about any reconfiguration that you attempt. I don't mean attempt in a way that implies it's possible to fail. That's just an issue of the use of language, and I don't mean that at all. But anything which you try out, you need to be able to demonstrate that that is effective for you. And you might think, well, I'm lying, or I'm misrepresenting myself. I would say not, because of the experience that you had. The student. Could you elaborate on that? Steve. The experience that you had was a revelation. I don't normally say this about people who've been on trips, because I know the harm that can arise from that, but you felt compelled to do it, and I respect you, so I listened, and I'm glad that I listened, because I think that the information that you brought, or was brought to you, in that state, is extremely valuable. Unless you collapse into grooved, complex ways of short-term reward and gratification of some instincts. So even your psychopath is actually working according to the gratification of instincts. Freud would say that, and he'd be right. And that they would then attempt to control the reality principle by saying, I'll get what I want. My short-term gratification is there. But the level of development of consciousness and of personality that they will achieve is flatlined. That's a trait of true psychopaths. They don't ever get beyond that level of adaptation. So everything that they are operates at that level, and they don't move beyond that. But you've had an experience that you're able to articulate that is affective, instinctive, and transpersonal simultaneously. There's a massive layering of representations of consciousness there, which indicate your potential. I would say that's where you should be going. Not necessarily back into another substance experience at all, but the content of what was revealed to you that's important. The student. I may have misunderstood you. I think I heard you say that I wasn't being dishonest. But I was, when I was out there saying things that weren't true. Steve. At what level is that dishonest? The student. I'm not sure. Could you be more specific? Steve. I mentioned the case of a psychopath. His level of operation is completely honest, given his character. He's not dishonest, and his instincts would agree with him, up to a point, and his genome would, because most likely he's a genetic variant of psychopathy. Therefore, he is being himself, and he's being absolutely true to himself. When you say that I'm being dishonest, in a relation to a part of you, yes, but in relation to other parts, no. The student. The dishonesty is between the care system, so the genome essentially, and the complex? Steve. The sensation or perception of a sense of dishonesty is a register of understanding that you know there are other parts of you which haven't come online yet, which would contradict the complexes. You're aware of some things that do contradict them. You've tested them, which is scientific. You've done it. It's an empirical fact that when you do certain things, they go away. And that's demonstrable. It's repeatable. That's absolutely great. The thing to really get now is down to what Jung would have called the anima, and we call the relating function, because that's to do with how you relate to the world, broadly, as well as only women, and whether you see women as something to gratify an instinctive urge or drive, or you see a woman as potentially someone to relate to, as a life partner. And you have said that. You're not dishonest, you're very honest actually, but what you're drawing out is a conflict within yourself. That's not dishonest to see into yourself and find that there's a conflict between certain instincts and other instincts, because instincts will compete with one another. If an individual is optimized because of their experience and their learning, as their complexes, to be a certain way, then the genome will accept that. But it will push, and it will say, there's this other side of you which has not yet been actualized. That will then generate a dissonance, cognitively, which says, I'm being dishonest. Yet you're not. You've just not acted the full bandwidth of your potential out yet, and it seems that when you were under the condition of having your brain chemistry altered, these things came through, and you experienced them as a felt experience. That's where your potential is, for growth. Your maximum potential is there. The student. I think the conflict, pursuing women in a nightclub, wanting a relationship but not feeling worthy of one, needs to be resolved first then. Steve. The conflict is present in your self-concept. That's to say, your consciousness of your autobiographical timeline, and how your personality, not your character is immutable, has configured itself along that timeline. That is where the conflict will be. So what version of you are you going to deploy, and for what ends? I do honestly think that the most growth that's going to come out for you, where your highest potential is, has to do with that experience that you had. It was represented in a way that your Miller number and its expanded condition could receive. This is another problem, unfortunately, with experiences like that when someone is out of them, we have a memory of them which we interpret cognitively. I was saying earlier that to interpret experiences like that in an affective, instinctual way can shift the ego into a transpersonal relationship to itself that elevates consciousness and connects you, doesn't separate you, but connects you to your genome and to your potential. But at that point, you will have to probably reconfigure your self-concept and say, this is actually what I want out of life, and not the way that you've been before. Otherwise, your complexes will keep trying, obviously, because they're so familiar to themselves. They haven't been reconfigured or optimized to be different. They're just going to try and carry on the way that they've always done it. The student. But to really believe that that's what I want out of life, there will need to be some action, and I'll need to have some experiences, right? Steve. You will, but this is the key. Which you is going to have the experiences? The former you, in your autobiographical timeline, that was configured in relationship to specific complexes, will find the path of least resistance based on its experience. Whereas your genome, which is potential experience as represented to you, is saying there is another way. That is going to be the conflict for you. And are you prepared to explore what that would mean for you? I'm not making a judgment, I'm just saying that that's what's being presented to you. If you reconfigure who you are, then who you present yourself as being will be of interest to a different kind of girl. One probably more likely to be a good life partner than something just for immediate gratification. The student. I think that there are universals in female attraction, though. Steve. The universals are always there, and they never go away. They're genetic, they're within a field, and they're epigenetic. This is how complexes can be passed down. If there's a change in the epigenome because of the experience of a grandparent, it could be just due to diet that goes down if it's not challenged or changed. It could be 2 or 3 generations before it wears off. A psychosocial experience which might generate a phobia or a complex or attraction to a certain kind of woman can also be expressed epigenetically. If we're talking about attraction to a certain woman, We go 2 generations down, say, it's reinforced, then it's re-epigenetically expressed, and it continues. This is where the Anima type can occur along a timeline. For example, a paternal timeline. Say a grandson or a great-grandson is attracted to the same kind of girl that his great-grandfather was, because of that epigenetic transmission of information, which forms part of a field which Jung called the Anima, for example. So what you're doing at the moment, or have been doing, is generating the capacity for an epigenetic expression of relating, which, if you had a son, for example, might be passed on without him having to have a direct experience. It would just be there. He would have to challenge that to change it, and if he challenges it, then his epigenetic expression of relating would reconfigure, and it would be passed on. The student. That is fascinating. Steve. James is working on this. He's actually working on the molecular biology of it at that level. Pauline and I have worked on the demonstrable, behavioural, psychosocial, psychological register of it, on the theoretical side, but James is actually working on the molecular biology of it as a geneticist. The student. That's very cool. I still have a lack of understanding of what to do. I have a circular issue in my head. There needs to be a new version of me deployed? Steve. Not immediately. I think it's important to say that, otherwise we just set another conflict up between a habitual version of you and a potential version of you, where it's one or the other. What I would say is don't contradict your complexes too much. Let them have their little say. But there should be another part of you, a partitioned part to some extent, which is concerned with the experience that you had. That is where the most growth potential will be, so you need to access a representation of that again. You don't need to go into the substance to do it, you have the memory of it, and you can ask your unconscious to give you more information. Engage with it through active imagination or self-hypnosis, and then build that representation up. And just leave the other things as you normally would. If you would normally contradict them, your complexes, that's fine. They're used to you contradicting them directly, but work on the other thing that's been gifted to you. Otherwise, that experience has been pointless. And I don't think it is pointless, in all honesty. The student. I guess the way it would start would be in my own family. Steve. Externally. But internally, you need to build a relationship to that experience, to say that your ego, your conscious, cognitive ego, accepts that there was a representation that was in another phase state, or qualia or qualias, of consciousness, that needs to be associated through meaning to the ego for it to be incorporated as an idea, which starts to restructure your approach. Then you'll find the rest of you will reconfigure at an appropriate rate. The student. I'll engage with it then in self-hypnosis, and I'll also engage with it cognitively to try to improve my understanding of it. Steve. As you do that, what you're indicating is that the signal has been received and respected, even if it's not fully understood, because respect suggests there will be a further exchange of energy and information, and that you're open to that. You want to be curious and understand yourself, basically, and you're saying, I value what happened. I'd like to know more, because that will help me solve my outer adaptive problems by updating my self-concept from within. Then you can change it on the outside, in the way that you're describing. The student. Yes, I even see this conversation as a huge step in integrating and associating with the experience. Steve. You've drawn this out of me. You've drawn it out because it's in you to draw it out. You know, a lot of people that I communicate with couldn't have this level of conversation, and I'd have to approach them completely differently. So you're already configured to do this. The student. I'm excited. That psychedelic experience wasn't my first, but now I feel like I have the knowledge to understand it, and I'm taking it much more seriously. The psychology has helped me have more confidence, cognitively, in what I saw, and has prevented me from not wanting to integrate it. Steve: when a person takes a substance, it's still an individual who is receiving that alteration of their brain chemistry. What comes up, even if it's universal, is very much the person's experience of the universal on an individual level. Which is why I don't recommend it, normally, but you seem to have gotten something very valuable out of it. I can't deny that. The student: I'm still trying to unpack whether it's something that I should ever do again, just because of the negative part of the experience. Steve: I could help you understand that. It's nothing to worry about, but obviously if you go into that state again, you may reconfigure the negative experience, and it may be amplified. I do honestly believe you've got enough to solve this. And sometimes if you poke the unconscious too much, when it's already given you what it thinks you need, it might take offence, even if it's only in the short term. I do think you've got enough. The student: I think so too.